Columbus is a name that should likely be familiar to many of you. There is a federal holiday in his honor every October. There's rhymes, some of which you may have even heard. In 1492, he sailed the ocean blue. So who was he exactly? Well, born in 1451 in Italy, his father was a merchant and a weaver, and himself, when he was a teenager, he went to go work in the merchant trade on the ships. He traveled extensively. And then in 1476, pirates attacked the ship he was on, sailing alongside Portugal. And Columbus, being apparently pretty clever, managed to escape and float away. And when he gets to the mainland, he spends time studying mathematics and navigation and cartography, which is map making. Now, during the time that Columbus lived, it was extremely difficult to get to Asia by land. The route covers thousands of miles, and along the way you were almost guaranteed to run into hostile tribes, dangerous armies, raiders, you name it. So the Portuguese begin thinking of ways to circumvent, and circumvent is a word meaning avoid by going around that land by sailing around Africa to Asia. So instead of going by land, you would go by sea, and it could be faster, and you would avoid a lot of the danger. So Columbus has an interesting idea. He thinks, wouldn't it be faster to sail west on the Atlantic instead of sailing around Africa? Which is worth noting, to this day, our maps underrepresent how enormous Africa is. So getting around it is a huge task. So it's a good idea in theory. However, his math was off. He mistakenly believed that the Earth's circumference, which means the distance around, was considerably smaller than fellow mapmakers and sailors at the time did. He also thought Europe was much bigger than it actually was, and he got the distance between Japan and China wrong as well. So he comes up with this idea: let's sail west on the Atlantic. He presents it to officials in Portugal and England. They reject it. Then the Spanish king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, they agree to finance him. They want to spread Catholicism and their influence. So they give him the go-ahead and the financing. He sets off in 1492 with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. And just over 2 months later, in October of 1492, he lands in what was probably the Bahamas. He then spends months before he returns back to Spain, going from island to island, looking for gold, silver, spices, anything that he promised to bring back to the Spanish royals. So he returns to the New World 3 more times, and the voyages, which started off on reasonably friendly, amicable terms with the natives and with his crew, get increasingly antagonistic and bad. I mean, he puts his brothers in charge of a settlement, and that goes really wrong. He begins enslaving the natives. Now, it's worth noting that slavery was common at this time, and to some degree, Columbus was a man of his time. And slavery was not what it would later become in the American South, but it was still obviously something very wrong and something cruel at times. That he was briefly imprisoned in Spain, and he was stripped by the king of his noble titles. Nevertheless, he manages to get cleared of some of the worst charges, and in 1502, the king pays for one last trip. He goes and he makes it as far as Panama, so he's nearly to the Pacific Ocean, but due to bad weather and understandable hostility from the natives, he returns to Spain more or less empty-handed. He dies about 4 years later in 1506. Some people say he died poor. He didn't. He was reasonably comfortable, but he was nowhere near as rich as he wanted to be, or he could have been if he wasn't stripped of some of his rights and privileges by the Spanish monarchs. He refused to accept that he had found a new world. He was convinced that he had just found another route to Asia. Others understood differently very quickly that what they were dealing with was something new, but he didn't. He died sure that he had just found what he attempted to find.